When we were setting up Resistance 1, our company secretary, June, was in contact with the head of the European Blind Union.
On a wall there is a sign of the European Union of the Blind.
A man called Mocrane Boussaid, I don't know if that's how you say his name, but nice man. And he invited June over to come and see him, which she did, and he told her that on the top floor of their building in Paris was the headquarters of the blind French resistance leaders who had survived and were now in their 80s.
A large brick building. A plaque displaying Braille.
So June made an appointment to see this guy.
Monsieur François Clapier, a man in his 80s with short grey receding hair.
Monsieur Clapier, and went up and had an interview with him and told him all about resistance and asked him whether he knew Jacques Lousseron. He was at first very, very sort of suspicious about us and our intentions, and said he hadn't. They certainly had a file on Jacques Lousseron because he was one of their members, and he argued a few details with June about Jacques Lousseron's life and things.
Monsieur Clapier, wearing a white shirt, sits in a chair, smiling.
And then towards the end of this interview, became a little bit more open and softened a bit to us, and said he wanted to support the project, and they were, as an organisation, sort of his members were sort of dying off, and they wanted somehow to be recognised for what they'd done, what they contributed in the Second World War. We left France, and I still hadn't met Monsieur Clapier that June had met a year before, and he hadn't been able to make it to the shows, which again was another disappointment. But it was always my ambition somehow to get an interview with him, so we would have first-hand evidence of a blind French resistance leader talking about their experience, which had been at the same time as Jacques Lousseron was operating in France. I mean, Jacques Lousseron talks about this network of resistance cells all over France that they were connected with, from you know, up in the north of France right down to Marseille.
This newspaper is our principal weapon. Catch!
We will need to increase to printing 20,000 copies by February.
Well, have you heard about this new German order that's been issued?
Yeah, our distribution teams must absorb the first job.
All men over 21 will be sent to Germany for forced labor.
Continue. Ready. Look, I know the discipline and patience of our 600 boys. I'm sure they can do it.
As a result of this new order, 80 of our members have just gone underground and become full-time operators.
So, alright, and with these additional distributors, an increase to 30,000 copies in March.
You have the funds to support more.
Well, great then, an increase of issues by 10,000 each month until we reach our limits.
This solves our problem in the north.
Yeah, split Paris into 5 zones. Plus, divided the suburbs in 7 ways, and we'll use this as a model for the other regions in the country.
But they're still keeping our circulation routes open across the border, so we can reach ourselves in Lyon and Marseille. And
when eventually I did get the interview set up with Monsieur Clapier, which took a good 2 years to negotiate. In fact, Monsieur Clapier was operating in Marseille, and though he didn't know Jacques Lousseron, and none of the blind members of the organisation knew each other because they were all working in secret, certainly, you know, it's quite possible that the resistance cell that Jacques Lousseron was operating in Paris had connections with the cell down in the south of France, and that's how information and even English airmen that were had landed in France got smuggled through and were rescued. So from the interview you can pick up some of the stories in the background and the attitude of Monsieur Clapier to you know, his experience of operating as a resistance fighter, and also how he related to other resistance fighters that he discovered after the Second World War who were also blind and in the same position as him.
On a wall there is a sign of the European Union of the Blind. A large brick building. A plaque displaying Braille.
If you would, Monsieur Clapier, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your life now?
Bon, maintenant, depuis
I've been the president of this association of blind resistance fighters for the last 15 years.
Et il y a une loi du 8 juillet 48.
Our organization came about because of a special law that recognized the efforts of blind people in the resistance. At the time, the blind resistance members were spread out all over France, and we had university professors, physiotherapists, piano tuners, but out of 150 original members, there are only 7 of us that are still alive now.
Were, out of the 150 blind and partially sighted resistance fighters, were there any women?
Oui, oui, il y a eu...
There were 4 members who were women,
deux aveugles qui ont été
and
fusillés.
9 of the blind resistance were shot by the Nazis,
Et 5 déportés, dont
and
une
5
femme.
of us deported.
Eh bien, ils étaient...
I was recruited exactly the same way everyone else in the resistance was recruited,
C'est-à-dire par relation personnelle.
through people who you knew.
Disons, les kinésies pouvaient fournir... du
Our
matériel.
physios could provide medicine for the resistance.
Alors, ensuite, ceux qui étaient... Il y avait des professeurs de musique.
And the music teachers who moved around a lot could visit different people and recruit new people to help.
Et alors, vous aviez... Et alors, les vendeurs de billets de loterie...
Also, there were the ones who sold lottery tickets, who met a lot of people, and they would write messages on lottery tickets.
Les Allemands respectaient la canne blanche.
Because the Germans respected the white cane, it made it easy for us to get around. For example, they wouldn't stop us or search our bags.
Is it because they didn't think that blind people could do anything?
Ça, il faudrait leur demander à eux.
You would have to ask them.
Bon. Bon, donc, alors, on confectionnait des tracts.
So, we began by putting out very simple and direct leaflets with things on them like "Down with the Germans" and "Kill the Bosch." It was very manual compared with the way information is distributed today. It was a matter of taking a batch of paper and stamping it over and over with a rubber stamp, then cutting the paper up into leaflets. Then we would go and give this to others, who would go and stick these leaflets up on the walls.
Ensuite, alors personnellement,
in March 1941, I was the one who organized the first demonstration against the German occupation in Marseille. It was at the time when the German army invaded Yugoslavia.
Alors, quand les Allemands il y a à
In
Marseille
Marseille, there is a monument in memory of King Alexander, who was Yugoslavian and was assassinated there back in 1934.
et donc nous avons voulu faire comme eux, mais il y avait
We wanted to be like the students who had demonstrated in Paris in November 1940, who got shot on the Champs-Élysées.
fleurir.
But there was not the same risk of that happening to us, as our part of France was not occupied in the same way.
D'Alexandre Grosnavy sur la place de la préfecture.
We decided to put flowers on the monument of King Alexander. But we put leaflets inside the bouquet, and the police didn't know.
Et alors, moi personnellement, j'ai été arrêté en mai 41.
I was arrested in May 1941 by the French police.
En civil, les renseignements généraux, quoi, la police.
I was just sticking up a leaflet, and a plainclothes policeman stopped me. Someone from the General Information. They beat me up to try and find out where I had got the leaflets, but I didn't speak.
Bon, et bien là j'avais un chef de réseau qui était l'abbé Blanc, n'est-ce pas?
We continued to gather information, and the fact that my uncle was the joint commander-in-chief of the port of Marseille meant that he was able to pass a lot of information through there, by boat and cargo ships, about what was going on. This continued until the commander of our network was arrested. This happened in 1943, when he and two women members went to a meeting and they were caught. He was deported to Buchenwald and the women were sent to Ravensbrück. I had decided not to go to that meeting. At that time, you either felt something was right or something was wrong. And I felt that meeting would not be right, so I didn't go.
La répression devenait...
Because of the growing repression and betrayals, our members were forced to leave Marseille in 1944 and join the Maquis, which is a resistance in the countryside and the mountains.
Non, décapité, ça veut dire...
The growing arrests put an end to a lot of different networks. They shot one of my comrades, and in July they shot 18 members, followed by another 7 a couple of days later.
Un camarade qui a été fusillé.
Did he, at the time he was working in the resistance, know any other blind or partially sighted active members?
Est-ce que vous connaissiez à l'époque d'autres membres de résistance aveugles ou malvoyants?
Non.
No.
So what was the relationship between him as a visually impaired member and the other members who weren't? How did they view him? What were their expectations of him and what he could do?
Non, enfin, du moins je m'en suis pas aperçu.
No, at least not that he realized at the time.
Okay.
Jacques et Jacques, non?
Coming to that.
C'est très bien.
Il n'y avait pas de réseau avec...
All the blind and partially sighted members of this association belonged to different networks around the country and were not aware of each other at the time, but there were blind resistance members shot, one in Brittany and the other near Lyon. One of them was caught cutting telephone wires.
Il m'est arrivé de transporter j'avais des messages.
I had to transport certain messages, and I remember it was the 27th of May 1944. But when I got to the rendezvous with this message, a siren went off and there was no one there. It was a bad day for our population because Americans were bombing Marseille and Avignon, killing a number of people in both cities. However, I knew which direction the person I was meant to be meeting was coming from, so I got out of the train and took that road. However, this led me right into the paths of the dropping bombs. I fell to the ground, and when I managed to pick myself up, I found a piece of shrapnel had cut my braces in half. But apart from this, I was uninjured, apart from a bloody nose and watering eyes. The air was thick with dust and affected my vision even more. But each time I changed where I was standing, a bomb dropped and just missed me. Unfortunately, others around me weren't so lucky.
Le nez, n'est-ce pas, le nez, les oreilles, mais enfin, j'étais pas blessé.
Okay.
Right. And a question about Jacques Lucéron. I just wanted to know whether he was ever a member of the association.
C'est une question par rapport à Monsieur Lucéron, Jacques
Oui.
Lucéron. Est-ce que lui, il était membre de la... Est-ce qu'il a été membre de
Oui.
l'association?
Oui.
Oui.
Il a été le vice-président.
Le vice-président?
Oui.
He was the vice president.
Avec Davin, quand Davin était président. Quand Davin était président, quand Davin a créé l'association.
When the association was created, when Davin was the president.
Okay. And would Monsieur Clapier mind telling me a bit about, what he knew about Jacques Lucéron during, well, obviously not during the war, but afterwards? I mean, does Mr. Clapier feel that Jacques Lucéron was he just part of the general resistance activities, I mean, what, because his book is very inspiring, and his story is an interesting story. But how does he view him? Yes, basically, just what is his how does he view him? Where does he come in the whole?
En fait, donc la question c'est par rapport à Monsieur Lucéron.
Oui.
Monsieur Lucéron, Jacques Lucéron. Qu'est-ce que vous connaissez de lui après la guerre? Comment vous le voyez?
Je ne l'ai pas connu.
Non, même pas après la guerre. Après la guerre, d'accord. He didn't know him, first of all, after the war. Est-ce que c'est juste Maria disait que par rapport à son livre, qu'elle a trouvé ça très inspirationnel, très inspirational, yeah, very.
The book and the story, but it sounds like his story could be the same as any of their stories, really, in terms of the. But I mean, his experiences about blindness are interesting.
Mais en même temps, ça aurait pu être un livre, l'histoire de n'importe qui parmi vous. Est-ce que vous avez une
non, moi j'ai pas d'opinion. J'ai pas d'opinion parce que je ne l'ai pas connu.
I don't have an opinion because first of all I didn't know him.
Donc je ne l'ai pas connu, donc je ne peux pas, vous voyez. Par contre, j'ai connu, parce que cette association, c'était assez curieux. Nous avions un père dominicain, membre de l'association.
So they had. He can't really speak about Jacques Lucéron because he didn't know him, but then Monsieur Clapier wants to say, but the association is very it's very singular, very curious. They had a Dominican father as a member,
oui. Et un pasteur protestant,
and a Protestant priest. C'est ça, pasteur, yeah.
Oui, c'est curieux.
And so it's, you know, it's curious. I think he's coming. Yeah.
C'est curieux, mais enfin, il y avait un pasteur de Nîmes, du sud-ouest, n'est-ce pas, qui est une terre protestante.
Donc très mélangé, c'est ça?
Pardon?
Très mélangé.
Très mélangé.
Very mixed.
C'était extrêmement mélangé, n'est-ce pas? C'était, au fond, comme la résistance d'ailleurs.
Exactly.
Comme toute la résistance, c'était très mélangé.
Like the resistance movement, which was very mixed,
Yes.
very,
Oui,
you know, big people from.
je crois que c'est ça qui est, fondamentalement, je crois que c'est ça, la résistance française, c'était quelque chose où il y avait de tout.
Fundamentally, it was that
Hein?
in the French resistance, you had people from everywhere.
Yes.
Il y avait des tout jeunes, des très âgés,
Very young, very old.
des ouvriers, des universitaires,
Workers,
de tout, quoi.
Students, university students.
Has Monsieur Clapier read the Jacques Lucéron book?
Est-ce que vous avez lu le livre de Jacques Lucéron?
Oui, je l'ai lu, il y a La lumière au fût.
Comment ça s'appelle? What's it called?
And There Was Light.
Yes, And There Was Light.
Oui, je l'ai lu, mais il y a longtemps, hein, parce que...
You read it but a long time ago?
Oui, parce qu'il a paru, là on a refait une édition.
D'accord.
On a refait une édition, mais c'était paru il y a longtemps, et je l'ai même ici, et je l'ai en cassette aussi.
Because
Alors.
that's another edition.
Oui.
Yes, he has read it, but it was a long time ago.
Okay. And did it strike him as being impressive in any way or not?
Est-ce que ça vous a frappé comme quelque chose d'impressionnant, donc une façon ou l'autre?
Non, c'est bien écrit, parce qu'il savait, c'est un universitaire, hein, c'est bien écrit. C'est bien écrit. Enfin, c'est, si vous préférez, d'autres personnes, enfin, des gens très simples, ont fait exactement comme lui aussi, n'est-ce pas? Seulement, ils se sont moins bien exprimés.
D'accord.
Hein?
Oui, yeah, I mean, he finds it was very well written. After all, he was a university-educated person. But Monsieur Clapier says, you know, there was lots of other people, perhaps we'd say much more simpler, who just who also had their story, but just weren't able to express it.
Oui.
That,
il a été déporté. Nous avons eu des camarades déportés.
He was deported, so had comrades.
Qui également.
There were other blind people that were deported and survived and came back. I want to ask you that.
Yes, donc il avait des gens, les aveugles, qui ont été déportés et qui sont revenus aussi, comme Jacques Lucéron.
Oui. Enfin, les aveugles, tous les aveugles qui ont été déportés sont tous revenus.
All the blind people who were deported and came back.
Really?
Oui.
All the blind men of the resistance.
Non, aucun, que ce soit notre camarade femme, qui était déportée à Ravensbrück, elle est revenue, n'est-ce pas? Et les autres sont revenus également, ceux qui ont été déportés, les autres camarades qui sont déportés sont revenus.
The two women who were deported to Ravensbrück and also other comrades that were deported came back.
How was it for blind and partially sighted people here in France before war, during the war, and what changes, how is it now? Are there any changes for blind and partially sighted people in France?
Contestable que depuis la libération.
Since the war, you can't deny that there has been a lot done for blind people in France with regards to studying and social services, and with our members, for instance. Those who sold lottery tickets were given the opportunity to study physiotherapy, and travelling musicians have been able to establish themselves in restaurants. Before the war, in 1939, a lot of blind people would have found themselves in a miserable situation unless they had a particular attitude to study. They could have been even beggars and destitute.
C'était vraiment un miséreux.
Can I ask what's you when you said you were a student when the war or just during the war?
Vous étiez étudiant pendant la guerre?
Oui.
What was your occupation after the war?
J'ai travaillé même à la fin de la guerre, j'ai travaillé dans l'administration.
Yes, he worked in the administration. He has two doctorates, yeah? State doctorates.
Oui. Et ensuite j'ai été universitaire, j'étais professeur de faculté.
And afterwards he was a professor at the university.
Okay, because I'm interested in this situation that occurred with Jacques Lusseron, that when he was studying, there was a Vichy decree that meant that if you couldn't say it meant that he couldn't in any public office like a magistracy, as a university professor. That's in his book.
À la libération, j'étais au cabinet
After the liberation,
du commissaire de la
I have held jobs in public office, and no one ever prevented me from doing so because of my sight, like Monsieur Lusseron. But maybe there was a difference for those who were totally blind.
Maybe, yeah. That's maybe that's the answer. We'll never know now. But thank you very much for your time and being so open. And yeah, no, it's been.
Interpreters for the Monsieur Clapier interview were Derek Pearson and Odette Batterell.